we're discussing SecondStreet.org's new series of survivors on socialism. And joining us here is Colin Craig, president of SecondStreet.org, but also a survivor of socialism himself from Nicaragua, Marco Navarro-Geni. Marco, thank you so much for joining us today. And, you have a very interesting story to tell. Your family lived under socialist dictatorships. Can you please explain what your family's experience was in Nicaragua?
Nicaraguan families, like most families in Latin America, are very closely knit. So there are ripples of the suffering from the socialist regime of the Sandinistas across all branches of the family. On my immediate family, my father, who was the mayor of a sort of mid-sized town, fourth largest town in Nicaragua, by virtue of the fact that he was the mayor and he had been part of the previous regime, so to speak. He was put in jail. All the goods and the properties that my father owned, some of which he had acquired from his parents, were confiscated or firebombed or completely destroyed. And so that's on the immediate side. And the same thing for my mother's properties. My father's brother-in-law was in the military. He was the commander of a small garrison in the interior of the country, fairly inconsequential in strategic concerns, and he refused to run. He was an honorable military man, and he decided that he was going to man his garrison and surrender the garrison to the new government. Well, the new government caught up with him, and they again imprisoned them, tortured them, and eventually they pitched him out of a flying helicopter.
They threw him out of a flying helicopter.
Yes, while alive.
Wow. Wow.
And we know we don't know where he is, right? So they have for now 40 years refused to tell the family in what part of the jungle they pitched them, because we have no idea.
Well, okay, hold on for a second though. Is Nicaragua, do they still have the socialist government?
That is an excellent question. That government lost an election in the 90s, and for about 14 years they were out of power, and then they returned, essentially using the playbook of the Chavista regime in Venezuela.
Wow.
They started by suppressing the freedom of the press. We were talking about that. The freedom of the press is often the canary in the coal mine. They seized the independent media, and then they started tinkering with the electoral system until the point where they are now. They control absolutely every institution of the state, and they have managed to silence every independent institution in civil society outside of the Catholic Church, and they're already going after the Catholic Church.
Wow. See, this is why it's so important that when there is a regime change for the better, that they pass lustration laws so that it prevents from some of these old criminals, these socialist criminals, from coming back and reviving their old habits, shall we say. So you obviously, your family was deeply affected and impacted by life under a socialist regime. What was it like for, your father's brother-in-law was the head of a little garrison, your father was a mayor. What about for the average Nicaraguan? And I'm not trying to diminish your situation, but for the average peasant, say, for example, in the mountain or something, how was life like for them under socialism?
Also, an excellent question. One should point out that this regime was popular at the beginning. Like many of these regimes tend to be quite populist and making enormous promises. There is at the heart of human beings a desire for justice. And all human societies have a measure of injustice. Nicaragua happened to have a pretty high one at the time. And so it was a popular regime at the beginning, but pretty quickly things changed because those in power began to amass more and more power. Some of these people were guerrillas who had been in the mountains fighting for 10, 15 years. They had no university degrees. They had never held a job. They hadn't had any opportunity to amass any kind of wealth. And within 5 years, they were some of the richest people in the country. And the poor maybe had a little bit more than they had before, but they were still poor. But the stark difference was quite visible. And so basically it was a role reversal. Um, the people who were in power and had some wealth were completely wiped out in a sense. And then the poor people remained poor, and this new sort of elite calling itself Sandinistas, they were in fact some modicum of socialist communists, were the new elite.
Okay, we've got to cut to commercial.